couldn't find the...
Okay.
We are online.
Okay, there must be a delay. Let's wait 30 seconds.
Okay.
Alô, alô, Brasil. Jorge Ben.
Good evening, everyone. Please, Professor Karin.
So, good afternoon and good evening, everybody. I'm very happy to be here with you and give you a warm welcome on behalf of FACAMP. We are here under the auspices of the activities of our study group on compliance from the post-graduation program in law from FACAMP. And I'm very, very happy to have our international guests. Well, first of all, I'm here also with my co-leader in the study group, Professor José Antônio Pontes. And we're having this live, which is also a lecture on blockchain, smart contracts, and technonationalism in the context of cryptocurrencies. And I'm very happy to have here with me Professor James Cooper, who is a professor of law at the California Western School of Law, and our lawyer specialized on intellectual property and blockchain, Emilio Casares from Casares Law and from the San Diego Blockchain Forum. So this live is a result of studies within the group. We have read the papers Professor Cooper and Emilio sent us. And well, without further delays, I give the word to Emilio, who will start the presentation. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Karen. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope that everybody can see my screen now. Is that perfect? So as Karen mentioned, my name is Emilio Casares. I'm an attorney here in California practicing intellectual property as well as blockchain law. I've been an avid advocate for blockchain technology for several years now, primarily due to its tendency and ability to decentralize trust, power, and the flow of capital. A big component of blockchain technology is a term that we've all probably heard before, smart contracts. I hope to in this presentation give you a primer on the technical and social component of smart contracts and to kind of frame how they are going to decentralize the internet. So smart contracts are, okay, so a brief history of smart contracts. The idea of an automated agreement has been around for quite some time, at least several decades. The concept of Ricardian contracts emerged in the mid-90s as an idea of essentially representing clauses, conditions, other type of well-understood contractual terms as computer instructions, so that a computer can process an agreement between people, and the use of cryptography to sign contracts or to sign a process with a cryptographic signature to make sure that the person who is supposed to be signing is cryptographically ensured to be the correct person. But the problem with original conception of smart contracts is that they didn't have any type of enforcement ability. They were kind of just a theory. Nick Szabo eventually, which is a well-known name in the blockchain space, coined the term smart contracts in a famous paper titled Formalizing and Securing Relationships on Public Networks. And the vision that Szabo saw was that if parties can displace a part of their trust to automated module that can actually move money between participants to an agreement can really reduce the cost of contracting, the cost of monitoring opposing parties, or I'm sorry, monitoring counterparty action and monitoring the performance of an agreement. But Szabo still didn't have the tools to actually create a mechanism that could could allow for instant settlement of obligations because there wasn't any type of Bitcoin or digital asset technology available at that time. But then we see in 2008 the launch of Bitcoin. So Bitcoin, as we all know, is the first, I guess, tested use case for blockchain technology, the first cryptocurrency. And there's a lot of conversation about what Bitcoin is and how it works, and you can find plenty of videos online explaining this. But Bitcoin, essentially, in my mind, is just a spreadsheet of accounts and balances. That's all it is at the end of the day. Who has how much Bitcoin? But the special thing about this system, excuse me, is that it is processed by a decentralized network of computers that come to a consensus as to what the accounts and balances are. And the reason why that is powerful, because on the Bitcoin blockchain, everybody on the network by definition agrees to the validity and veracity of the information, which has a big potential to reduce the cost of transacting globally. If everybody can be sure as to the credit or the funds held by a counterparty. So Bitcoin fundamentally changed the way that we see information. Information can be trustworthy if you get a network of computers to agree that that information is trustworthy. So Bitcoin allowed people to move value around, but what smart contracts essentially are, they're kind of like computer programs that run on top of Bitcoin. So if Bitcoin is just a list of wallets and addresses and balances, then smart contracts are computer programs that move those balances around, that check the numbers, that essentially perform operations and processes on a decentralized computer. And like Bitcoin, the processes are confirmed by a network of computers. And what I mean by that is that if a computer, a program is drafted as a smart contract to say, if this condition is met, a payout of this amount is going to be sent. Everybody on the network can be absolutely sure that that module of code is going to perform as expected. So the payee of the example that I just gave has an incentive, or at least a reduced risk, to engage in that agreement because there's more trust that the counterparty will actually settle that transaction. And that is a big deal for e-commerce and for new types of business models that are facilitated by smart contracts that I'll get into. After the launch of Ethereum and which is the so-called smart contract blockchain, their whole use case was that they were building on Bitcoin by developing smart contracts. Now we see states and other legislative bodies around the world try to understand how these frameworks fit into the existing recognition of what a contract is and what contractual obligations are. And to, I guess, maybe no one's surprise in these times, a lot of the working groups and committees around understanding how smart contracts fit into a regulatory framework, a lot of the conversation right now is being driven around how this technology can help us with elections, with counting votes. If you can have a voting system that is decentralized, and everybody that participates in it can be assured that the votes are counted to a rule set that everybody on the network agrees to, which has the immense power to create trust in transacting on the internet. So the utility of smart contracts, why are they powerful? Well, first and foremost, observability. Smart contracts are all open code on the Ethereum blockchain. Well, smart contracts on the Ethereum. There's plenty of other blockchains, but for the sake of this conversation, we'll stick to Ethereum. But observability. All engagement, activity, economic activity relating to that smart contract is being tracked in real time. The code and the processes themselves are inspectable by all the parties. Even the public market can inspect these types of contracts. So you reduce the cost of discovery in understanding how a counterparty is engaging with a particular a contractual agreement. Verifiability as well. You have a permanent record of the contract, the permanent record of the people who have signed the contract, and the permanent record of the processes that involve that smart contract. Everything is being stored in this master blockchain database, so there's a clear and concise record of what's going on. Of course, when you actually inspect this, you need to have somebody who knows how to inspect this code. A judge will probably be very confused if you just printed out all this information. But the information is there and it's decipherable, and it's a powerful and permanent record. And in some cases, it could yield course of performance information. So if the contract itself is configured to monitor the performance of the parties and use that as input to inform another algorithm that decides how the parties are going to perform, for example, the course of performance around pricing data, it really starts to advance the efficiency of smart contracts and contracting. Contracts are also cryptographically secure and minimal vulnerability to third parties. Also, enforceability. So in the smart contract sense, what is powerful is the idea of deterministic enforcement. The idea that the contract enforces itself because the code is configured to operate no matter what. Both of the parties who give life to the smart contract oftentimes don't have control over the contract itself. It is put onto the blockchain, and the blockchain is trusted by the parties to operate the code in a predictable way. That is a powerful thing, but it's also a risky thing because it's automated and verifiable and unstoppable, which could mean that a dispute ex post being like after an alleged smart contract breach or after a smart contract did something incorrectly, then you have to deal with this wind-up problem where now the blockchain is doing its own thing and it's not really what the parties intended. And there could be problems in the enforceability of smart contracts. And in the long term, probably what is, I think, the most powerful concept behind the smart contracts is how modular they are. You can start to define agreements and agreements and relationships with open source code and open source templates. I think that this is going to radically reduce the cost of obtaining complex legal and financial services, because people can begin to assemble things that are configured to be interoperable with a global marketplace. But people can do that from their computers with relatively minimal technical expertise. So smart contracts have a lot of utility, but are they enforceable? Are they compliant with how the courts understand a common law contracts? So if we go back to law school a bit, I'm sure we have a few students here that are in the process of learning these basics now, but we know that contracts don't always have to be in the same form. They can be oral, contracts can be implied. What is important though is mutual assent, offer and acceptance, that the parties actually have a meeting of the minds as to what their contractual expectations are, and that there is consideration for the agreement. Contracts historically are either just privately enforced between the parties through settlement mechanisms or by the state. We are in a society where we need a judge to interpret a document in order to understand the scope of some type of term, and the other remedy for breach. Now, that type of system is good for certain types of agreements, but for certain type of more transactional based agreements where the counterparties are relatively sophisticated, the cost of litigating a dispute may be far beyond the interest of the parties if they can arbitrate their dispute in some more automated way that's consistent with their business practices. And we're already seeing things like that happening in the smart contract space. And then with back to the contract basics, the scope of a contract being defined by words instead of terms, instead of code, of course. But a contract does not have any type of settlement mechanism embedded into it. It is just an expression of some abstract agreement, but it doesn't have any functional utility like a smart contract does. So how do smart contracts fit in the current framework? Well, the legality of smart contracts is relatively uncontroversial. If a smart contract is used in to fulfill or to mitigate or to facilitate a legal agreement, and the parties intend it to have that use, it's uncontroversial that that could be a contract under common law principles, so long as the parties actually have a meeting of the minds. And there's a ton of papers essentially reaching this same conclusion, that they doubt any court would void a smart contract on the basis that it's not a written contract. Of course, if the requirements for a contract are otherwise met. That being said, a lot of the state legislators have passed kind of forward-looking regulation that denies the court the ability to do exactly that. So essentially saying, hey, smart contracts can be agreements, and they are used as such. Now, this type of thinking isn't inconsistent with precedent. There's plenty of precedent, like Bibb v. Allen, which is a famous case involving the use of Morse code to fulfill orders of cotton. There's no agreement because it's just a signal saying this much cotton, this price, right? But if the court finds that there's a course of dealing between the parties where they're used to this electronic transmission as fulfilling, inferring, or implying an actual legal obligation, then it can be used as such. And that's what we've seen as early as 1893. Existing EDI practice within corporations, there's a lot of electronic data exchange. There's a lot, of course, of precedent that gives value to data as informing the scope of a legal obligation. Perhaps in the case of Lamley versus excuse me, I have the wrong case on the screen there, but Lamley versus Mattel, saying that you can use agricultural data or third-party API data to inform a pricing algorithm on a smart contract. So this is already well practiced, but it's just not in the smart contract format. So moving on to legal considerations for smart contract formation. So we know that smart contracts can be legal agreements so long as they meet the requirements under common law. Now I want to talk about what you want to keep in mind if you have any clients that are dealing with smart contracts or operate or want to develop smart contracts for their platform. So the first and foremost question being, what needs to be automated? Smart contracts, while they are powerful for efficiency and enforceability principles, they don't always do the job because they get too complex. There's securities and bug issues. So a question that a company really has to ask themselves is do we really need to automate this? A lot of companies in the blockchain space are using smart contracts just for very simple operations, such as moving money into and out of a treasury, collecting votes. So things that are ordinarily kind of just a moving value around. That's what smart contracts are good for. You can really get intense with how complex and structured a smart contract is, but you'll find that that developers want to make it as simple as possible. And the Ethereum blockchain, for example, certain processes require gas, which is like a fee. So if you have a smart contract that's so complex, it could just become too expensive to use it. So there's a lot of design principles around efficiency in the smart contract domain for that reason, for cost purposes. How is the contract terminated and accepted? Here, a lot of the times there's some type of a recognition of a token. You can send some money to a certain address as a way of indicating assent. And when you have a legal agreement that supplements a smart contract, which would be a best practice for any big scale agreement, you would want to kind of specify and coordinate the operation of those smart contracts with the actual semantic word-based agreement, including trying to link the wallet addresses and the accounts to really bring clarity to what this code-based smart contract is doing. And if a company wants to release code, they should always have it audited. Smart contracts, it's a very security, it's a nightmare for ambitious smart contract projects. We see a lot of hacks in this space, and that is usually due to some vulnerability in the smart contract. So if a company is going to put a smart contract out there and the market is going to engage with it, potentially rely on it, give value to it, the company needs to consider its liability in light of any potential security vulnerabilities. As I mentioned before, understanding the code. So is there a meeting of the mind? Do the parties understand what the code is purporting to do, what it's going to do? If they understand what it's going to do and it operates as such, then that is consistent with a legal agreement. But if the code is doing some unpredictable thing, the question becomes, okay, well, what happens? Who's in charge? Who's responsible if there's a loss of money because a smart contract behaved inconsistently or was otherwise attacked? So here are representations and warranties, understanding that and getting on paper that the parties have agreed, have read the code, they reviewed the code, they understand the code, and here it really matters like which side of the transaction you're on, the technical sophistication of the parties. If parties are interacting with smart contracts and blockchain, they don't know what they're doing, there's a high chance that something can go wrong. So you want to keep into account the technical sophistication of a client in these scenarios. So protecting the smart contract, in this smart contract space, it's all gamification. What I mean by that is that like the attack vectors for smart contracts are not necessarily hacks in the classical way where somebody is bypassing some security mechanism. Rather, it's more that these people will interact with smart contracts in a way, or they'll spam contracts in a way which could have some undesirable consequence, like liquidity draining out of account into some other account. So you want to make sure that people obviously on paper agreed not to do that to smart contracts that they're involved in, creating legal expectations as to how the party is going to treat a contract on the blockchain. Another important one, title and authorization. So a smart contract is going to accept cryptocurrency. It's going to take in cryptocurrency and it's going to move cryptocurrency around. But where did that cryptocurrency come from? Did it come from any list of, any wallets on OFAC's lists of prohibited wallets, right? OFAC maintains a list of wallets that it says you're not allowed to do business with. You want to make sure that all the money coming into your account doesn't touch any of the money elsewhere. And the final point on considerations for smart contract formation is this idea of qualified code deference. So smart contracts are operating on the back end. We have kind of a legal understanding on paper of what they're supposed to do, but there's still some type of area in between what the party's expectations are and what and the realm of possibilities of what the code can do. Where it makes sense, you want the parties to give deference to the code as unappealable and non-binding, the output of the smart contract being recognized as such. Here, the technical sophistication of the parties matters, but it at least gives certainty in the case where some type of event that is not within the party's expectation occurs. And now we at least know that there's some resolution behind it, some finality. Otherwise, we just leave everything to the blockchain and money just gets lost. Now, that all being said, people can negotiate for what happens after a smart contract failure, but the enforcement cost of that, it's going to be hard because it's really, really hard to get money out of wallets on the blockchain, especially the person who owns the wallet is unknown, is anonymous, and wants to keep the money, right? The blockchain is a hard, a tough world in that sense for when somebody has done something wrong. It's really tough for a court to do anything about it. But in certain cases, you want to defer to the output of the code as being the legally binding event. So material adverse exception events. Now, these are the types of events that maybe grounds for avoiding some type of obligations under a contract, or for some type of procedure that your client would embark on after one of these events occurring, in order to kind of comport with the expectation of the parties, and those being consensus attacks of the blockchain, bugs. If somebody's signed a cryptographic a signature, but didn't have the authority to, if it's hacked. And finally, oracle corruption. So smart contracts need data sometimes from third parties. These third parties in the blockchain space are known as oracles, and they feed smart contracts data to then rely on to process and to spit out a result. But where does that data come from? Right? Like, you want to be sure that if the smart contract is relying on any type of data, who's in charge of that data, and what happens if that data is incorrect. This is actually kind of a big problem in the blockchain. Everybody trusts the blockchain, but the information that goes into the blockchain isn't necessarily trustworthy. So creating trust around that data, especially if that data is important to any contractual obligation that is involved with a smart contract operation. So an example of a smart contract would be a use case of smart contracts, because there are plenty of out there in the Ethereum blockchain ecosystem. I highly recommend you check out all the Ethereum projects. People are doing some fascinating stuff, from designing election platforms, voting platforms, to creating digital art marketplaces, decentralized gaming. It is really a fascinating space. And one is special to me, a client of mine known as Super Rare, who runs the most prominent fine digital art marketplace on the Ethereum blockchain. And their business model, to a large extent, is automated on the back end through smart contracts, which is a very powerful thing. So you have these artists who have an artwork, and they create this artwork, and they want to sell that artwork as a digital artwork. So what they do is they mint this piece of art as a token representing the artist's ownership and expression of that piece of art. But now you have this token that is recognized as a digital asset, the same as cryptocurrency, and it's involved in a marketplace where any person can place a bid on it, can buy it outright, as long as they engage with the smart contract. And what the smart contract is going to do, it's going to just see if the offer was valid, if it met the reserve price, or if it was accepted by the artist, and it's just going to move the token from location A to location B. Instant settlement, instant fee collected by the artist, and instant fee collected by the service provider. Now, that is a very powerful concept where you can automate the back end of your business, and then allow for experimentation, because people can kind of build onto these smart contracts, and you can develop modules and different type of marketplace activity or ways to engage with the market, and it's all on a decentralized, publicly accessible database, which is a very fascinating thing. Another fascinating thing about the Super marketplace contracts is that on the subsequent sale, from the primary sale to the from the first collector to the second collector, anytime that occurs within the smart contract, a royalty is taken out of that sale and given back to the artist. So now the artist is collecting royalties, and the artist isn't doing anything to collect the royalties. It's just happening on the back end, so long as their work moves through this marketplace. Now, the potential here is huge, and especially in this digital art realm, this digital media realm, where the interaction with the content is already digital, so the computer can start to capture how people are engaging with content. You can feed that content, that engagement data, into a smart contract, so the smart contract can decide where does the value go from that engagement. Does it go to the artist? Does it go back to the company, right? It's a space that I think everyone should keep their eye on as it's growing, and I think it's probably the first like real big use cases for smart contracts that are attracting a lot of interest. So to conclude here, kind of looking into the future, seeing where smart contracts are going to thrive, global implementations in financial technology, which Professor Jamie Cooper is going to talk about a bit. Seeing how now there's going to be interoperability between the way financial services are rendered. Of course, there already is interoperability. There's lots of standards, such as like all the banking and messaging standards. But now these standards are not just going to be instructions for how the banks do business. These standards are going to be the processes themselves that move money around the world. The protocol becomes the standard, not just some standard in the abstract, and the protocol fulfills itself. Digital media embracing smart contracts. As I mentioned before, the digital art space is blowing up, and we're seeing a lot of experimentation around different royalty structures and other types of cryptographic like locks. Like, for example, if an artist doesn't want their work sold more than 300 times in a year, because why would they? Maybe the artist can embed locks on their own work to control how the market treats their works. So you're going to see a lot of tailored types of nuanced agreements that have functionality that operate with protocols. And one that is probably deserving of its own course is decentralized organizations. So if you've heard of DAOs or the DAO, decentralized autonomous organizations, essentially what those are just a network of smart contracts assembled together for the purpose of creating some type of organization. There's a lot of experimentation in this space, but a lot of room to grow as these organizations that are built on blockchain technology mature. And that is all. So I think we're opening up for questions. But if we're not open up for questions, we can just advance to Professor Cooper's presentation.
Well, I would suggest that we skip immediately to Professor Cooper, and then we go back to the questions. What do you think, Professor Zantonio?
Here, please, be our guest, Professor James Cooper.
Just one technical issue. Let's make sure that Professor Cooper will appear in his presentation. We have the oral speaker screen appearing.
Hello, everyone. Testing 1, 2. Can you hear me okay? Hello? Test
Go
1, 2.
on. Please go on. It's automatic.
All right. Allo, allo, Brazil. Brincadeira. This is live and direct from La Jolla, California. Hello. Thank you, FACAMP, for the invitation. To Professor Jose Antonio Pontes, Zay, thank you. And to Professor Dr. Karen Klemp, thank you also for the invitation. It's great to work with you again, Dr. Karen. It's a joy. You were here in San Diego in 2012 for a symposium sponsored by the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. And we've worked together also on an anti-piracy project for the State Department over 12 years ago. So it's just great that with this new technology and new aspirations of both lawyers, these are opportunities, and we are certainly leveraging and taking advantage of them. So thank you, everyone, for attending. I should tell you outright, I come to this as a technophobe. I am fundamentally afraid of technology. I grew up in a house that still had 12 o'clock flashing on our VCRs. If that doesn't mean anything to you, then you're too young. And if you're smiling like our hosts, Dr. Karen and Dr. Zay, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. We just didn't know how to program our video cassette recorders, VCRs. But we're not here to talk about VCRs. The acronyms we're going to be talking about are central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. CBD is something else in California. We're not going to talk about that, cannabinoids and the cannabis business. We're talking about another area slightly connected because, candidly, a lot of the press that sucks up most of the oxygen in the room concerning cryptocurrency and blockchain is that it's a mechanism to help money laundering and narco profits. It's not that. And I'm here to talk about this incredible technology that has the potential to really allow the internet to be what it's meant to be. If you could go one more, Amelia, please. Thank you. Let me talk a little bit about my background first to tell you about the strange journey I've had as a technophobe. When I was a kid, I was a teenage pirate. I used to make concert t-shirts and headbands for concerts like David Bowie and Queen and sell them after the show and The Who, and never convicted. Detained but never convicted. And the statute of limitations is over, so I can talk about it now. But the best part of this was many years later, I ended up as a photographer for Marie Claire magazine doing work in Brazil. I did an interview with Jose Sarney many years ago in Hosanna, long before they found all that money on the table in San Luis. But this was for Marie Claire, the women's fashion magazine. Many of my photographs were taken by a Italian newspaper called Il Corriere della Sera. And hell hath no fury like an intellectual property lawyer, former pirater, spurned. I'd actually gone to law school in Italy, so I understood the civil law system. So we sued for like 8 million lira, which I think was like $4. No, it was like 8,000 Canadian dollars. And to make a long story short, we settled, and I found myself in the rare position of having been on the piracy side and then on the victim IP violation side. And then fast forward to 2014, I'm on the U.S. delegation to the World Intellectual Property Organization it's called the Advisory Committee on Enforcement in Geneva, helping the U.S. government figure out how to promote enforcement among the developing world and pay attention to TRIPS. So it's been an amazing journey. And after 2 decades plus of disruption, both in the legal sector and now in the technology sector, let me just say whatever I'm talking about today is not the opinion of anybody but Wikipedia. No, it's not the opinion of anybody but me. I'm not representing any government. I've done work for governments on these kinds of technologies. I'm not representing any of them. What I'm saying today are my own thoughts. So that's the disclaimer I speak of below. So let's talk about the outline of the presentation in the next slide, please, Emilio. First, I'm going to address what private digital tokens are. That's in essence what Emilio was talking about, what's called fintech or financial technology. And this is the idea of blockchain and the different kinds of tokens or currencies that you can put on this wonderful technology. Blockchain doesn't just have to be about cryptocurrency. That's what most of the media talks about. It's also, as Emilio alluded to, it can be used for democracy, for direct democracy. It can be used for food security so that you can follow the provenance of the fish you eat from the boat in the ocean all the way to your table. It can be used for all sorts of things, like to ensure that you're not getting genetically modified organisms or hormones in your beef or antibiotics in your fish. It can be used for IP micropayments to indigenous people. There are so many ways that blockchain can liberate and truly allow the internet. If you think of web, this is Web 3.0. The World Wide Web in Mosaic, Netscape, some of the early browsers, even up to Safari, that's internet or Web 1.0. Social media, Facebook, Instagram, and so forth, that would be Web 2.0. You're still using an intermediary. The nice part about Web 3.0 is there's no need for the traditional intermediaries like banks or social media companies or any of the other platforms that we're used to. It can be more person to person and allow for greater digital sovereignty. And that's where smart contracts built on Ethereum and some of the other chains, that's the freedom that we get. Now, as lawyers and lawyers to be, that should also cause some concern because guess what? We're intermediaries too. Okay, lawyers are intermediaries. And the nice part about smart contracts is you don't need lawyers anymore and you don't need courts or arbitrators because it's all done through code where your bank accounts are linked. So that if goods are supposed to cross a border and they're held in customs or if nobody pays, your bank account is deducted automatically. That kind of law by code, contract enforcement by code, are the private digital tokens and the smart contracts that are part of financial technology or fintech. That's what Emilio was talking about. But that's actually not what my presentation is about, but I want to give you the alternative. Instead, we're talking about central banks, where in essence, these are digital currencies that are digital representations of a country's fiat currency, the money. It's about the future of money, because CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, are effectively a government-issued cryptocurrency designed to use cryptography to replace the traditional physical form. So instead of using that dirty money that you get, it's done through your phone, and it requires a smartphone. So the term CBDC is pretty broad because it involves all sorts of different critical decisions on the part of an issuing central bank, and is a threat to sovereignty if we allow it to be. But we'll talk more about that. I want to look at how the US is approaching it, or not approaching it, candidly, how the Chinese are approaching it at a massive meta level through what's called the DCEP, the Digital Currency Electronic Payment Plan. You're going to hear you're going to have a smorgasbord, a churrascaria of acronyms. Okay, DCEP, CBDC, PPP. You're going to get them all today. So you're going to be very full. You have to, if you're at some of these full-witted chows, you're going to have to push the red button. I don't want to be served any more acronyms. Thank you. We're going to look at some other jurisdictions, because as good as the Chinese are, you never believe who the first the first mover was to institute formally as a central bank digital currency. That was last week. The Bahamas, the so-called sand dollar, is now alive and well. There are other jurisdictions. There are so many different jurisdictions that are now experimenting. Of course, we experiment and we test in the West. The Chinese deploy. It's as simple as that. While we're figuring out, looking at our navel, is that my navel? Oh, that's what a CP. We test stuff. The Chinese are out there already. They did a lottery on October 12th where they gave away $1.5 million to see if people would use it. This digital currency. In essence, you're paying using your phone, and you can transfer money, but it's not Ethereum. It's not any of these private coins. It's a true sovereign currency. Okay, and then at the end of all of this, I'm going to try, assuming there's time, in the next 15-20 minutes, to look at the need for legal clarity, certainty, and to call for better coordination. If the Bank of International Settlements, the central bank for central banks, and the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are searching for what to do, because these Bretton Woods institutions that were created in 1944 are looking for a gig, because we're in a world of disruption, maybe that's something they can help with, or the OECD. So that's sort of the outline of the presentation. So about private digital coins, something that Emilio touched on is that it's decentralized. There's not an issue with that's a representative of any underlying asset or liability. There's not a real underlying undergirding asset or liability. But there are concerns over investor protection. A lot of these private tokens have been subject to what are called initial coin offerings, like IPOs, like initial public offerings. They become a security potentially. They could be a currency, they could be a security, they could be a commodity, or they could be a utility, depending on how they're used. And you might say, well, why does that matter? Well, it matters for legal purposes, because if in the United States, or if you're selling to U.S. persons, you fall within the 1933 and 1934 Securities Act. You might be issuing securities without properly registering them, without disclosing all the requisite disclosure and reporting requirements that issuers have to provide. And you'll be breaking the law in the U.S. And even if you're not a U.S. entity, but you're selling to U.S. people, U.S. persons, you still might get captured by the extraterritorial nature of U.S. securities law. So there's been a lot of fraud. In fact, in May of 2018, the Wall Street Journal did a front page report, and they studied over 1,400 different cryptocurrency ICOs. Have I frozen? Can you guys hear me? Looks to me like I've frozen.
Okay,
It's perfect.
we listen.
Oh, thank you. Sorry,
Go on.
from my end, it froze. So the Wall Street Journal did this report and found that 271 of the 1,451 of the 1,451 ICOs that they studied turned out to be fraudulent. In 271 of 1400, I wrote a series of pieces for The Hill or CoinDesk and CoinTime, a bunch of online platforms, saying, I'm shocked. Not that I'm shocked that there's fraud. I'm shocked that there's not that much fraud, because 271 out of 1,451, given what I was seeing in the industry, didn't seem like a lot of fraud. These so-called white papers or business plans had, in the world of digital private digital tokens, it was staggering how much fraud there was. And this is a time when I was working with several Chinese, mainland Chinese cryptocurrency and blockchain companies that were doing this work. So I was very keen on making sure we dotted our I's, as we say in English, and crossed our T's, that we did our due diligence, that we weren't defrauding investors, because there was a lot of vapor, a lot of, make-believe in that industry, and people lost their investments, and that was a shame. There's also an issue over security, because you want to make sure these are hack-proof. They cannot be hacked. That if you're keeping a digital wallet on your phone, that people can't get to it. Hackers, nefarious actors can't break in. Amelia, could you go back to the slide before, please? Just for a sec, thanks. Oh, right, well, there you go. So there's a lot of issues also about terrorism financing, about narco dollars going from the cartels or snakeheads or human traffickers, arms traffickers, drug traffickers. There are ways to obfuscate and to create, through cryptography, and to move assets across borders without the proper vigilance of national regulators. So those were the main concerns that private digital tokens brought about. Well, while this was going on, central banks got in on the action. Okay, thanks for moving forward, Amelia, if you would, please. So I talked briefly about what are central bank digital currencies, but the decision is very broad about how to use the term and how to do it, because the issuing bank has to decide whether it should be a general purpose digital currency that's available for use by the general population, or if not, whether the issuing authority, the central bank, may decide to make it available only for wholesale transactions among banks, so interbank settlements, or it could be used among central banks between those, between central banks themselves. And the move towards a central bank digital currency, which is a digital representation of your currency, is supporting the trend of more of a cashless society. We've seen in South Korea and the People's Republic of China and Sweden, the cash is well on becoming a redundant means of payment. So let me ask if you, I wanted to also talk about global and national financial stability, that by putting it online, by creating digital forms of currency, potentially you can create incredible instability through quantitative easing, through hacks, and make, it's one thing when you're printing currency and there's only one group like the US Mint that prints the dollars, other than the North Koreans. But the US Mint is supposed to be the only one printing dollars, right? Now it's, if you were to put the dollar in a digital form, it's potentially hackable. You could create all sorts of a mayhem with the US dollar, especially because it's a reserve currency. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So let's talk also about the legal foundations. How do you create the legal means necessary to allow for central banks to create digital currency? So, and what regulatory certainty we can create nationally and through a global coordination. Thanks for moving on to the next slide, Amelia. So I call this CBDC 101. Oh, I mentioned all these things. But the important thing that you should know is that over 1/5 of the central banks in the world are now exploring how to use CBDCs. And in fact, the last week, we've learned that the Bank of International Settlements, which is the central bank of central banks out of Basel, Switzerland, is now working with the National Bank of Switzerland to test a Swiss franc central bank digital currency. For years, in March 2008, again in August of the year, they've been releasing reports saying, oh no, you got to be careful. And the IMF did a report a couple of weeks ago, you got to be careful, that we should study it. And groups of 7 countries are working together. The Japanese, the European Central Bank is even in on it. The Canadian, it's not, your normal developing country, because by the way, it's also being done in places like Iran and Venezuela, which are not the most stable or the most financially accessible or transparent systems around. Plus, they're also subject to U.S. and in some cases international sanctions, banking, money transfers, investments. To even just do any business in dollars is problematic. The other piece of the Venezuela has a government created a year and a bit ago something called the Petro, which they said is under written by oil reserves. The only trouble is if you do the due diligence, those are the same oil reserves for the future that they already got loans for money from the People's Republic of China and Brazil, and and Russia. So it's actually a second mortgage. So it's not a very stably backed digital currency. Thanks for moving forward, Amelia, to the next slide. So there are different kinds of these kind of central bank currencies. There's the decentralized standalone currency. There's algorithmically managed stable coins. There are reserve-backed stable coins built on open permissionless blockchains, which is more technical, and new privately defined stable coins built on permissionless blockchains. And we'll talk about the Libra and what Facebook has attempted to do, or at least introduced in July of 2019. And really, all of this is a reaction to Facebook trying to create its own digital currency. Please, if you would go ahead, because I'm cognizant of the time. So I want to look at a comparative approach. And I use social dumping as an international trade scholar. Social dumping is when you sell a product in another country that you make in your own country for less than what you sell it for in your own country, with a view to destroying the domestic industry, the domestic producers in another country. So you're selling it for less and to kill off your competitors, and then you raise the price after they all go out of business. So say you're building, say you're Brazil and you want to sell sugar or orange juice, and kill off the Florida producers, so it becomes impossible for them to sell because you're selling at a lower price, with the idea of hurting those marketplaces, and then you jack up the price. Well, social dumping is taking advantage of other countries' lax environmental regulations or lax less stringent labor regulations, and with a view to increasing your own profit. So it's called social dumping, the social justice aspect of dumping. Again, going to other countries and taking advantage of the fact that those countries don't protect against child labor, or you can pollute whatever you want, they don't care, or there's open corruption. And so what ends up happening is you have a race to the bottom. So instead of everybody trying to lift up the boats so that there's a higher level of harmonized rules, think of financial probity with respect to central currencies, you're seeing a reduction. And that's what we got to worry about. Why? Because there's incredible geopolitics involved here. What we're talking about is economic or nationalism through technology, technonationalism. And how are we seeing this? Well, the U.S. has been the global leader on building the internet, the space program, but being first mover doesn't mean you get to keep the business, right? Being first on solar, eventually the Germans and the Chinese come in and do it better. Or with car production, we saw the Japanese and then the Koreans do it better than the Americans. Of course, the Europeans as well. So this idea of being first mover doesn't always work. Well, same thing with cryptocurrency and some of these other technologies. And right now, China, the People's Republic of China, mainland China, has been for many years has been working to through its Made in China 2025 policy. It's a form of national industrial policy, which they have the sovereign right to do. They're picking all these winners and putting all the money that they're making through their trade surplus, through their foreign exchange, because they sell because of their smokestack economy and selling, low skilled and increasingly higher skilled products, tertiary products now. Instead of just primary products, they're banking all that money, the hundreds of billions of dollars in foreign reserves they make every year through their trade surplus, and they're picking winners and losers. No different than Brazil in the 60s and 70s would pick, instead of bringing in cars from Europe or America, they'd rather build a car in its state interventionism using state-owned enterprises. It happened throughout, this is leftover from ECLA, the Economic Commission for Latin America. This is the result of Fernando Henrique Cardozo and the Dependency School, Oswaldo Sunkel. These are the sorts of economic and sociologists that encouraged a more import substitution idea. You incentivize your internal production. And what China has done is said, we're going to dominate AI artificial intelligence. We're going to dominate blockchain. We're going to dominate self-driving cars, autonomous vehicles. We're going to dominate the semiconductors. We're going to dominate a number of other issues, which, by the way, are all intellectual property intensive. So these old days, this idea of, the Confucian idea of China as a copycat economy, they're producing, according to the World Intellectual Property Organization, China is filing more patents than any other country, including the EU collectively, Japan, the US, and in some cases, in some years, more than Japan and the EU combined. Now, what those stats don't tell you that 90% of their patents get vacated after a year, but don't let the story get in the way of my lecture or the truth. Point I want to make is that intellectual property, which has traditionally been a first world, developed world part of the globalization bargain, has been the idea that we in the North, industrialized North, we do all the thinking and do the IP, and that's why we were all so focused on TRIPS, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property under the World Trade Organization, where we're so focused on seeking rents and royalties and other license fees from the rest of the world. We do the inventing and we just send out all those crappy jobs somewhere else. That was the theory of our in the North and Western, the Western industrialized nations. This was our globalization bargain in the mid-90s. We'll just send the crappy jobs and let China be the smokestack economy. Well, guess what? They're now doing a lot of the inventing. And that's sort of and part of that inventing is a digital currency that, when combined with their one belt, one road international strategy of investment and integration, while the US is moving towards an America first trade policy and focusing internally with their isolationist policy, China is now going out into 71 different countries saying, you want to be part of our new Silk Road, both in the maritime way and in the land way. And we're going to layer on some blockchain so that we have a much more efficient distribution and use and efficiencies in everything from energy to food to all sorts of resources. So would you go ahead, if you would, please, Amelia? We'll go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, the U.S. we've been navel gazing. It wasn't until in July of 2019 that we said, oh, and when Mark Zuckerberg and David Marcus, as VP from Facebook, went in front of different congressional committees in the U.S. and said, hey, we're ready to start a new digital currency, and all of a sudden, all the lawmakers in the U.S. are like, oh no, Facebook's going to do it before we will. This non-state actor, which has 2 billion users, and do we want Facebook, which is not exactly right now in everybody's good books because of the backlash of technology with political ads and data privacy concerns, and the fact they lose our millions of users' pictures, oops, and they own all our data, all that stuff. It's like, now we want to trust them with a digital currency that could put the US dollar, and they said, no, it'll be a basket of currency. So all of a sudden, and Mark Zuckerberg, I wish I had put this in there. When you hear what he says, well, if you don't let us do it, China's going to do it. Do you want us to do it, or do you want China to do it? And the U.S. just said, oh my God. And we're still busy trying to figure out, is it a commodity, crypto? Is it a security that needs to be traded? If it's a commodity, it's who's the agency that's going to regulate this? Because if it's a commodity, it's the CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission in Chicago. If it's a security, it's the Securities and Exchange Commission. If it's a currency, that's the Department of Treasury and the Office of Currency Controller, right? If it's a utility, well, it's something else. What is it? Is it a dessert topping or a floor polisher? Maybe it's both. Doesn't taste so good. So what's the right agency to deal with this in the private token world? And now we got to worry about it at a global level. And in comes the pandemic. So we also got issues of federalism, because like Brazil and Canada and Mexico and Argentina, these are federal countries, federalized. So how do we balance all those powers? What are the right competencies? And you start to see different U.S. states like Wyoming or South Dakota, California a little late at the switch. How Delaware is always where you do all, because it's so easy to set up a corporation. Where's the best place to do cryptocurrency? It's in Puerto Rico. And you see this again, even within the United States, this dumbing down to the lowest common denominator. What's all the boats, not floating up, but floating down. So if you would to go forward, dear sir. And I've gone way longer, but so there've been early legislative attempts to privatize, to deal with private tokens, stepping away from these central bank ones. And there have been attempts to from an Arizona congressman named Paul Gosar to Sherrod Brown, the senator from Iowa, from Illinois, to try to figure out how to best manage this and keep the U.S. economy competitive, because we don't want Singapore, which is super friendly to private tokens, to be the ones where everybody's going to register and do their work. Because capital formation, one of the things that brings the U.S. economy so much success is the ability to raise capital. So we're talking about comparative and competitive capital formation. Where's the best place to raise money? Where the least number of regulations? So there was a Token Taxonomy Act. There was a Cryptocurrency Act. Hester Pierce, known as Crypto Mom at the SEC, who's brilliant and understands the value of this, and is only one of 5 commissioners at the SEC, put together a 3-year safe haven proposal to encourage issuers to do cryptocurrency work in the U.S., because the U.S. doesn't want to lose out to China or to Singapore or to South Korea or to Japan, where 40% of all private crypto transactions are denominated in yen. So it plays a role, the private piece. And now let's go back to the public, the central bank at a meta level, if you would, Emilio, to the top level, because we're all reacting to what the former chair of the CFTC, Chris Giancarlo, and his brother have a project called the digital dollar. And it was only when Libra finally in July of 2019 said, we're going to do this, we're going to create a different kind of cryptocurrency, and they changed what it would be. It would be a bundle of currencies. Oh no, and now it's going to be a stable coin. It's going to be a different way that, it's not going to be US backed. It's going to be it freaked everybody out. So now we're on to, oh God, we got to do something. So there's a great project, digitaldollarproject.org. If you want to check it out, digitaldollarproject.org. They're attempting to get us to stop thinking about it and start testing. Please, Emilio, if you go forward. And I am looking at the clock. So PS, October last year, just over a year ago, it was blockchain day. President Xi talked about it as, he's against cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency is still banned in China, but blockchain's okay. It was banned until the Chinese government, totally centralized, wants to create a decentralized currency. Think about that for a second. The ultimate centralized government, right, is now supporting blockchain, which is a decentralized, and they've got to be scratching their head saying, well, how do we do this? And they've created not just the DCEP, which they're now testing in Shenzhen, a city of what was 30 years ago 20,000 people, now 20 million, just north of the border of Hong Kong. Shenzhen is now the test case where they actually did a 10 million won, 1.5 million dollar lottery just back a few weeks ago. That was a total success in increments of like $29, 200 yen, 200 won. There's also a private blockchain called the BSN, the Blockchain Related Services Network, which is layering on everything onto the DCP, so that when you pay for stuff using the digital RMB, the renminbi or the yuan, the currency of China, that they can track what you're doing. So there's issues of privacy rights now. Are you consuming too much? What are you buying? Maybe you're a corrupt official because now you're buying all this stuff that we can see that you're buying, like all these Louis Vuitton purses and trips to Macau to go gambling. That fits into privacy too, and the anti-corruption idea of President Xi. But also healthcare. Are you ordering too many pepperoni pizzas, so now they're not going to give you healthcare, and they can combine those things, right? Or you're on Netflix or the Chinese version of Netflix, and you want to watch a new a super violent movie, and they cross-reference that with your healthcare records and say, no, you've got some heart issues. We can't let you see that. So imagine the privacy issues that come with that. But you layer on energy use, you layer on bank loans, you layer on all these different, and the Chinese command economy is able to do that. So not only are they testing, they're testing like testing on steroids. So we're still, is it a commodity? Is it, yeah, we're still trying to figure this out. They're already testing and giving it away. Some say the October 12th lottery wasn't successful. I'll leave it to others. I'm not up on how they measured that, but it was called a red envelope event where they give out red envelopes like a Chinese New Year's. Could you go on ahead one more, please? So the U.S. response was in our paycheck protection program, which was the $2 trillion stimulus. 17 million households in the U.S. 17 million households in the U.S. are unbanked. They don't have bank accounts. People in rural areas, they can't get to an ATM. So the idea was to give people a stimulus check by not giving them a check, but by giving them through a digital dollar project. There was an early draft of a bill of the PPP that provided for that. It didn't get anywhere because President Trump wanted his name on the check. So that wasn't going to pass because every check that people got had President Trump's name on it. Again, I point to the digital dollar project, a really interesting project, and I salute Chris Giancarlo for his efforts. What else you got there on the next slide? Because I'm going to have to wind it up. The Chinese and the Americans are not the only game in town. In fact, Sweden's way ahead. Norway's ahead. The Bank of France is looking at the European Central Bank. That bank's only been around since they started the euro in the early 2000s, right? Headquartered in Frankfurt. They're on it. Israel. If you could go down to other jurisdictions, one more slide, please. I mentioned the sand dollar, which is the first to actually go to market. I mentioned Petro. There's all sorts of issues with it. Could Zimbabwe be next? How do you handle 1,000,000% inflation? And by the way, when the Wuhan lockdown first happened, there were early reports that people were pulling yuan, the Chinese currency, off the streets and to sanitize it. They were actually pulling it off and putting digital to encourage people to move to a cashless society because there was a worry that the fomites of the virus could be on the dollar. That was just conspiracy theory, but there were reports of that in legitimate source newspapers and news platforms about that. P.S. You can't get COVID from money that we know of. I'm not a doctor. I only play one on TV, but I've done a little bit of research on that. So the Bank of International Settlements, the OECD, the IMF, the World Economic Forum, everybody came out in 2016, 2017 against this is dangerous. Cryptocurrency, period. Central bank cryptocurrency, central bank digital currency, absolutely not. P.S. A couple of weeks ago, IMF is now, we're into it. Bank of International Settlements, the central bank of central bank, is working with the Swiss central bank. They just put out a report with 7 different central banks, leading central banks, who are also looking at it, but they're moving to much more aggressively towards experimentation. We're busy navel gazing. The Chinese are deploying. That's, I guess, the message I want to give you. So we're a little behind on this, and we better move fast. The entire world's being digitized because of COVID. Everything has moved online. We need to rethink how we do these things. What are the benefits of that by moving to a cashless society, by being able to track and better prioritize how people spend their money. But keep in mind that many central banks still need the legal authority to go to the digital piece. And then finally, as the central banks work through the issues, what does this is really a backlash to Libra. It's also a clarion call for the return of state sovereignty, that they're saying, you know what, we're going to take this decentralized idea of distributed ledgers and we're going to make it totally centralized. So it's like the state sovereignty roaring back. So if you move forward one more, if you would, please. You can go one more. So we need legal clarity. If you go one more forward, and let me just say thank you. If you want to take a look at the work I do outside of law school, globallab.io, and some of the legal reform work that I've done is at proyectoacceso.com. Reach out to me by email if you're interested in talking further or want to do a hackathon. Brazil is very big in the space. There's some very, very smart cryptographers and business people looking at this. It's an amazing aspect, as you know, the Jatinho. This is like a digital currency Jatinho. You know, think of it as like a Jogo de Bicho with your smartphone. So on that note, I'll turn it over to our host. Thank you for your attention. I'm sorry I went so long. Did I go fast enough?
Yes, thank you very much, Jamie. It was a pleasure to have you here with us. And Emilio as well. Thank you very much for your presentations. Wonderful, very instructive, didactic. And I'll now give the word to Zé Antonio so that he can handle the questions. Thank you, Zé.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Professor James Cooper, Emilio Casares, for this brilliant presentation. It's an honor for us to have you here. And well, we will start the second part with opening the questions to the general public that is watching us at the YouTube channel. And first, it's I would like to make a question, and I invite the students and researchers to enter the sessions as previously arranged. And if you, the general public that are watching us, want to make questions, please be comfortable to use the YouTube chatting. I will manage it as soon as possible. Well, it's an honor to chat with two experts in these topics related to law, blockchain contracts, and cryptocurrencies, regulation, all this new world, and the regulations and or the lack of it, as we can understand. I would like to talk about a possible issue concerning security, smart contracts, and all those algorithmic languages. There is a kind of definitive translation of natural language to algorithmic language. Smart contracts, I believe, I want to ask you if they are only a small part of a new form of infrastructure transformation, or otherwise they came to completely override the modern liberal conceptions. For example, our formation was completely based in modern liberal rights, the individual rights, the law interpretation, and the law adjudication by judges, as well as traditional institutions like states and other institutions that may enforce it. Is that a general change? Is there a revolution that's coming up? It's the first question. You may please be comfortable to answer, or Emilio or Jim Cooper, in picking one of these questions as you want, okay? I will highlight some topics. There are new concepts underpinning blockchain, smart contracts, and cryptocurrencies as well. These concepts are sustainability, good economy, democratization of finance, access to work, production, and of course, transparency, ethics, etc. But there are human agents, we may say, deciding when we have some trouble. For example, I have read somewhere that in the beginning of some cryptocurrencies, there, like Ether, for example, a hacking forced a huge community to a so-called, if I'm not wrong, hard fork to reveal all the blockchain data and restore credibility. So there's a kind of decentralized regulation. People are managing it. In your opinion, who are managing it? Who are those agents? What do they think? And should people trust those decentralized way of life? Could the whole new system simply develop capitalism from inside the current capitalist way of life in which we live? And finally, consider the crypto geopolitics of all those new relations that Jamie, Cooper, and Emilio showed us with brilliant remarks. If culture transformation is inevitable, why wouldn't other cultures take over the whole block? For example, you mentioned China or Russia or other countries that are massively investing in blockchain. So my questions are concerned more about politics and the trends concerning culture and the transformation of infrastructure. Please be comfortable to pick one of these topics because there are a lot of issues here. Thank you.
Sure, I'll dive into the question of what you're talking about in terms of like who controls the blockchain and whether or not the smart contract itself changes the nature of agreements. And I think, so in regards to control, it's a very interesting point because we talk about these blockchains and we revere them for their decentralization, for their trust. We kind of theorize them as these organizations that fulfill the purpose of the organization itself rather than like any individual participants, which more or less from a technical perspective is true. Who controls the blockchain in terms of the actual hard consensus? Well, that's going to be the miners of the blockchain, the actual nodes who process the transactions. And depending on the blockchain, control over a sufficient amount of nodes by definition gives you control of the blockchain. And by control, I mean the last edit of the blockchain was made by you, and then now all the nodes will follow the longest chain. So there's like this idea of hard consensus that kind of injects somewhat of like a free market principles into governance, because now control of the network it's up for grabs, right? It's supposed to be decentralized. It's not supposed to be controlled by anybody, but any group of sophisticated actors can collude or even publicly announce that they're going to take control over it and they're going to do it in this way, and the protocol is going to allow it. As you referred to with this DAO hack, you had essentially, which was this automated venture capital fund, and it was hacked. And there was a big controversy around it because there was no real agreement between any of the participants of the DAO. In fact, the only type of like written agreements in this case was everybody saying that the law is the code, that the code of this organization will be the law and the output will be recognized. But the problem was that it was hacked and everybody's expectations were, like, oh no, I lost all my money, right? But important point brought up by Jose is that the Ethereum blockchain forked itself in order to reverse all those transactions. Now, who allowed that to happen? Well, essentially the core developers of the Ethereum blockchain. A small group of active Twitter people and of sophisticated crypto innovators carry a large amount of influence. So when they signal to the rest of the community, hey, we've decided that we're going to fork the blockchain, who's with us? Everybody raises their hand. So what is control in this? There's a social aspect of it where it seems to be centralized, but at the end of the day, if you want to have control, you need that social influence to permeate the hard consensus and to gain control over the nodes. You can do that through social influence. You can do that through hard buying power, the way that China has in a large case with the Bitcoin network by running large pools of miners. So this issue of control, it's multifaceted and it's very unclear, and it's kind of interesting because you now see companies who decentralize an aspect of control over their own operations, opening it up to the community, which has its benefits in terms of like it's consumer friendly, right? Like imagine if Instagram all of a sudden was going to solicit the input from everybody and reward them for their data. That's an interesting new business model. But if Instagram, the way the blockchain does, says, hey, we're going to now allow protocol changes and the community can govern those protocol changes, it's this interesting power dynamic because you see central authorities sacrificing at least some portion of their power to distributed consensus mechanisms, which I think is powerful. And we're seeing now just like a big transformation into the nature of ownership, the nature of these types of agreements to be more distributed, the flow of capital being peer-to-peer, even within organizations, as opposed to peer-to-peer in an entire blockchain, a peer-to-peer within an organization operating on the blockchain. So I think it changes the nature of control, and we're going to see more intermediated types of government of governance hierarchies on the blockchain. So I think we're going to go away from the pure, like, the core developers are the ones who are going to carry all the social influence, the whales, the early Bitcoin buyers. Right now they have a lot of influence, but I think we're going to see eventually that split up. But it definitely does kind of like pose that question: is this really decentralized? And in a lot of the cases, the answer is no.
Thank you, Zay, for that question. As I'm thinking about it, and Emilio's answer is, I think, spot on. There's a fissure. There's a split between the initial cyberpunks, libertarians, free market people who really wanted to see the intermediaries leave, and this not to be about money and to be about freedom. And then there's all the venture capitalists who wanted to make a lot of money from this, and others who were speculating on Bitcoin, to Emilio's point. And and that's the same dynamic in social media. Early Facebook folks who wanted to see this technology bring people together, and now it's being used to tear people apart through political ads and fake news and trolling and all that kind of stuff. And I think a similar dynamic is happening in blockchain, like it will with AI. Whose ethics? Our ethics in the West, Western industrial nations, or white privileged nation, however you want to call it, the Enlightenment folks, or the dictatorships. And by the way, there's a lot of crossover between the two. Who's going to, whose rules? Is it going to be our AI rules where you're not allowed to use there are ethics attached to it, which, by the way, in the US, we don't have any rules. We're relying on the market, just like we don't have any regulation of any of this stuff, or regulation of social media, versus, even Beijing's got, there's a Beijing principles on AI. The Europeans, the Australians even come out with AI principles. So there's a race now for what are the ethical pieces, and then how do you enforce it? And I think that idea of enforcement, it shouldn't be the people with the biggest wallets, but inevitably that may happen, even though the spirit, the very genesis of these projects are people in rooms wearing jeans and ripped t-shirts, and eventually someone's got to pay for it, so they go to the venture capitalist world. So that fissure, that cognitive dissonance over these technologies will continue, unfortunately.
Thank you, James Cooper, Emilio. Professor Karin Klemp, please, your question.
Well, I think I'll give way to the students that research so bravely. So I will give the word to them in the order that they delivered the. I will start with Thiago. Thiago, please go ahead.
Okay, hello there. First of all, I just want to congratulate you all for this great presentation. And so, going to my question now, in recent times, we have witnessed a trade war between the US and China. The tension generated between these two countries is directly connected to the geopolitical and the technological sovereignty. Lately, the discussion on the 5G technology has been growing, and this topic has affected many countries, such as Australia, Japan, England, and more recently, Brazil. In this sense, what are your impressions on this important subject that could impact the entire global economy, bringing eventual impacts on the international data protection? Thank you.
Thank you, Thiago. Emil, you want to speak to this, or? Okay. And 5G is one of those things that the Made in China 2025 policy is about. They're focused on that. Huawei is a state-owned enterprise or state-funded enterprise, just like Boeing is in the U.S. Okay, I don't want to. I should have said P.S. This is no different than the common agricultural policy of the EU or Japanese rice farmers getting special subsidies or keeping out lower cost Vietnamese or Thai rice, or us supporting the U.S. supporting or the French supporting French filmmakers. Industries or popular Brazil, there are ways that we keep out foreign competitors in our respective countries using a variety of national industrial policy, foreign investment regulations, and other proto-nationalistic economic policies that are usually involved. The simplest ones are tariffs. Raise the tariffs, the product becomes too expensive, people will buy their homegrown stuff. The thing with 5G is there's our 5G in the US or in the West, and then there's their 5G, Huawei. Their 5G is being coupled or somehow conflated with the idea that there's a backdoor that they can listen in on all our stuff, that the Chinese are somehow going to, or the People's Liberation Army or their whatever unit within those agencies or agencies within those the military industrial complex in that country are going to listen in on what we're doing and get trade secrets or military secrets or whatever. My first answer to that is, what? Like nobody else does that? One. Two, since Global Crossings, which is Chinese owned bot, got into started doing switching work for the U.S. military, or we buy all our uniforms from we used to, I don't know about now, from Chinese vendors. We have created a globally integrated supply chain. Now, if you want to decouple these economies, let's just say the West and China and the Chinese camp, it should be part of a bigger strategy. And so what the U.S. is going around doing is saying, if you want, you can do business with them or you can do business with us. Mike Pompeo, our Secretary of State, is going around saying, hello, Britain, if you're going to buy the cheaper, better product from Huawei, you can, but we're not going to do business with you, and you're not going to sign a free trade deal with us, and we're not going to do all sorts of things with you or share information with you. So you are seeing this decoupling, and I think it's inevitable, but we have to be consistent. If you look at ZTE, for example, another Chinese state-owned enterprise or partially funded enterprise, President Trump initially said he was going to put them on the entities list as well. Department of Commerce, Department of Defense. We have a series of governmental ways to regulate whether our telecommunications equipment can go elsewhere. Now, part of that is also like, don't sell it to Iran. Huawei used some of our components, put it into some products, and then sold it to Iran or North Korea where we have sanctions. And that's one of the reasons we've been hammering away and putting them on the entities list, Huawei. Likewise, ZTE has been accused of the same. And then President Trump said, we're going to ban ZTE from doing business with us. And then he turned around and he said, no, I don't want any job losses. Job losses in China? We're not being consistent in our foreign policy or in our trade policy. And I think that's important. But this stuff is not just trade policy. It's coupled with our views on all the multilateral institutions, playing in the WTO, playing with climate change accord, playing in these areas where if we're not going to be a true multilateralist internationalist, and we're going to be nationalistic in our approaches in America first, then we have to understand that we're going to force a lot of countries to have to make a decision, and they might not decide our way. It'll be unfortunate, but they might not decide our way. And Brazil's one of them. And Brazil does the same thing, by the way. Go to Paraguay, and they don't talk about those pinche gringos. They talk about the Brazilians, the ugly Americans of Latin America. It used to be Argentina. Now it's you guys. And it's because all the Brazilian banks are buying up Paraguayan banks. They're buying up Bolivia. Petrobras is coming in, or your monolithic, huge, behemoth economic powers are brought to bear within your region. Just like in Nigeria, it happens for the Nigerians in West Africa, or in Southern Africa, South African companies from the Republic of South Africa. So this is a global phenomenon. And we have to decide whether we're going to be better together and lift all the boats up together, or we're going to be proto-nationalist. And if we are going to be proto-nationalist, it's going to be super inefficient. If you decouple the economies and rely on our internet and your internet, our AI and your AI, our 5G and your 5G, it's going to be problematic. And it also plays a role in how we deal with foreign direct investment. Like when we stopped Broadcom, a Singaporean company funded in part by some Chinese money, from buying up Qualcomm here in San Diego, huge multinational company in telecommunications. It's the 5G leader for the US. Because of 5G, we stopped them, CFIUS, which is the Committee for Foreign Investment in the US, an interagency review board that stops investors from other countries from buying up. But if we're saying no to China, we also have to get ready to say no to Saudi Arabia, which owns a lot of assets here. And we have to say no to the French. And we have to say no to so many other investors. And that flies in the face of capital formation, flies in the face of job creation, and flies in the face of comparative advantage, which is the basis of our entire world trading system. So there's, maybe I'm asking more questions than I'm answering, Tiago, but I think you raise a great point. And 5G is going to be the newest play. And after 5G, it's going to be AI. And then who knows what it'll be next? Smart cities, the technologies will. But as long as national security is part of this matrix, and in making policy, then right now it's about public health. But public health has a national. But we're going to move in that direction. And just like COVAX, whether we're going to be part of a global vaccine initiative or whether we're going to do it on our own. These are important issues for national industrial policy, but also for global health and global economic welfare. I hope I answered it in some way, your question.
Yes, of course. Thank you.
It's a very good question. Thank you.
Okay, we have here present joining us 3 more law students. And let's listen to the question in the order. Anthony, after that, Andre, and after that, Antonio, please.
Just remember that André is not a law student anymore. He's part of our research group.
Of course, it's a lawyer. Forgive me.
So he's paying, right? He's got to pay for this.
So, Anthony, your word.
Thanks, Harry. So first of all, I'd like to thank both of the professors for the lecture. And moving forward to the question, there's a very interesting aspect of public ledgers in general, but blockchain specific, that I like to direct my question, which is method of consensus. Both of the professors have already addressed in their speeches both proof of work and proof of stake in a certain point, when they talked about the bigger the wallet, the bigger the domination that they have at the blockchain. And I like to, first of all, point my question to if there may be an importance of quantum computing in blockchain processing, because there are statistics that show that processing capabilities of quantum computing is much bigger than our actual. So if there's a possibility of sovereignty issues based on that. And the other part of the question is there any other, is there a way to win this threshold of method of consensus based on a proof of stake or proof of work? Is there any other possibilities, or that's the only thing we have at the table right now? Thanks.
Yeah, I'm happy to dive in there. Like regarding the, well, first of all, I'm not a professor at any university. I've had the opportunity to guest a lecture before, but I'm just Emilio. But in regards to your question with respect to the quantum resistant of blockchains, that's certainly something that people have talked about a lot for a long time in regarding Bitcoin in particular, the resistance to like a quantum attack. As we explained earlier, a proof of work is a method of consensus that essentially awards people with higher computing power. So if anybody had access to an infinite reserve of computing power or a quantum computer or something along that, there's a possibility that it can be tampered with. They are trying to design quantum resistant blockchains and methods of consensus where the Byzantine fault tolerance is resistant to a quantum attack. But that being said, I think it's acknowledged in this space that it is a risk, and it is a risk for any any designer of a blockchain, but I think you would need someone with more a cryptography experience to really explain the nuances there. But the important part here, kind of, and I think it's interesting when you now point out a vulnerability in a network as being an advancement in computing in general. So now the security mechanism of the consensus actually incentivizes like progression of the arts in terms of processing power. So there's some interesting incentive alignments there, because like the harder, the more you innovate with computers, the easier it is to attack those computers, but you're innovating in computers. So there's kind of some incentives there. But that being said, there's all types of different consensus mechanisms and all types of innovation happening in this space, and designing the most secure and reliable one. The problem that consensus mechanisms seek to solve is to try to be able to arrive at the correct answer given a certain amount of dishonest participants in a network. And there's a lot of game theory mechanics that can be work to come up with an algorithm that effectively randomizes trust in an organization. And you're seeing in the proof of stake context, so proof of stake is essentially saying you put up money, and that wallet is essentially going to be in the list of wallets that is going to be selected to confirm transactions on the blockchain. But there's also delegation mechanics within proof of stake networks. So people that are participating but don't have access to a lot of capital can delegate their funds to a larger pool, where they'll get the rewards based on their proportionate contribution. So it's interesting that we have like these economic methods of consensus that are supposed to give some type of economically fair result, but they actually help with the fault tolerant, or I'm sorry, a Byzantine fault tolerance, which is kind of a term in that describes how resistant to an attack any consensus mechanism is. So there's economic ways to design consensus algorithms, but then there's also algorithmic that depends on like a game theoretical approach. But there is a lot of research, a lot of investigation around like which of them works the best, whether it's Ripple, Bitcoin, EOS, Ethereum. They all have slightly different mechanics, but they're based on similar principles. But in order to explain them all, you'd have to honestly be like a PhD in cryptography. They're very, very, very complicated types of algorithms, types of computing. But I'm hoping that we'll see continued experimentation and innovation in this space. But as of now, it's really I don't think anyone's ever hacked the Bitcoin blockchain. So they're resistant as of now, but I guess we'll see when somebody gets a hold of a quantum computer and starts to mess around with the numbers.
I have nothing to add except that Emilio is an engineer, and I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Next question, Andre Moura, attorney of law.
May I begin? Are you hearing me? Okay. To begin with, I want to thank you both for this impressive lecture. It has been a great experience, and it is a great honor to hear experts on such important subjects that, from my perspective, is likely to change the world in a very profound way in the next years. My question is this. A recent Gartner study called Predicts 2019, The Ambiguous Future of Privacy, states that in 2022, almost 75% of public blockchains will suffer privacy poisoning. That being said, what are the legal and technological solutions addressed to this issue in order to mitigate exposure to the risk of fines and to comply with data protection laws in the short, medium, and long term? Also, what are your concerns about how this problem will affect the development of blockchain solutions, especially in the Western world?
Emilio, let me try to answer first. Great question, or two questions. I'm not as I say, 12 is still flashing on my VCR, so I'm probably not the right person to answer the first question. But the second question, with respect to how companies can deal with privacy issues, well, if you're operating in China, you don't have to worry about that. Although they're making efforts too to deal with privacy. But they're inevitably the issues of the monopoly that the Chinese Communist Party has on society and on all their political governance issues will always reign supreme. That being said, that's the opportunity for the West, is to find, and I don't think you can legislate your way in Europe. You can legislate your way there because you've got the GDPR, that's rightfully or wrongfully, whether it's working or not, it's a whole different discussion. At least on the books, they're going to have to pay attention to those issues, and that's a comparative disadvantage. I think in the U.S., where we still don't have it, California, we have something not as stringent as the GDPR, but we do have something since January of this year. Data privacy and digital sovereignty are going to be the selling points, are going to be the features, advantages, and benefits that come with working in a Western or a U.S.-based blockchain environment. Whereas, and that's going to be what they can sell to the general public globally, is that that we will be that buffer between you and the potential of a hack. And I think that's where a lot of the conversation is going to be had over privacy. But we're still working out simple stuff like whether Google through YouTube is allowed to follow and then to sell to children under 16, and that's been a major. And they were fined for not paying attention to the rules just a few months ago. Not a lot of press about that. So we need to have that conversation, and it is a comparative advantage for Western companies to play that card. Same thing in genomic testing and AI and everything else. Privacy is going to be the thing that the consumer should want, and we have to educate the consumer why they want that. Emilio, did you want to speak to the tech part?
Sure, I'll add briefly, and I'm not a privacy attorney, so I can't speak into like the actual implications of the GDPR. The only like kind of a common sense advice I could give to a company that's like, that has data on the blockchain is to explain to all of its customers, how the blockchain stores data and what type of data is going to be stored on the blockchain. Because in a lot of the cases, the services offered from a blockchain service provider, they have no choice but to put that information on the blockchain, because that's the way that the consensus will work. It has to be public. So there's kind of like an interesting divide into like how are these companies going to be enforced against or fined when they're just like implementing this technology that is pretty agnostic to privacy. But that being said, I see the technological solution as developing before any type of really effective legal framework can address the questions around privacy and blockchain. There's already privacy-oriented blockchains that facilitate anonymous transactions, which the United States government is like actively opposed to, because currently these types of networks really foster like the dark web activity. But clearly any consumer can see like the modern day importance of having privacy in transactions, and the benefit of this technology of being able to achieve consensus in an anonymous way is a technological breakthrough that I think that we'll continue to see involved in these protocols. Because in the Web 3.0 version of society, user data, user engagement, all of the type of information that the market usually uses to value and identify and to make a money off of you, that type of information can, instead of being pinged to all the servers around the world that don't belong to you, that can start to be embedded into your wallet, into your ownership, so that technological restrictions on that data are forced upon the people that are using that data. So it becomes very access oriented. If people want your data, they're going to ask you for it, and smart contracts are going to facilitate that exchange of data. Whereas where the current status quo is that all of the service providers hold on to all of your data, and they usually and the way they access it or engage with it is not on a public database. It's on their own back-end processes, that the only type of enforcement mechanism you have is through private action after the fact, or hoping that a government, a regulatory authority steps in. So I think that the technological marvel here is that you can create an access mechanic around private data, where the data can be programmed itself to either expire after a certain date or to lock people out after a certain date. And now you can have like a user-focused internet that uses smart contracts to protect data. And then also, in not just protecting, but profiting off of. I'm not sure if you're aware of the Brave browser, but Brave is an internet browser that actually rewards its users in tokens based on their engagement with advertisements. So now since the user is the one who provides the value by being engaged and being a probability of a sale, now the user can actually get the reward for that by engaging. So that's kind of like a play on how privacy is treated in Web 3.0. If these type of code become standard, then hopefully we can see a more user-driven and user-owned internet.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. Last question, Antonio Sestito, por favor.
Good night, professors. And I'm going to make a question relating data protection legislation. And so one of the primary difference between the traditional computer environment system and the blockchain is the environment itself, what it is designed to do. We know that while in a standard system, there is a centralized with regard to decision about the data protection edition. In the blockchain, on the other hand, there is an idea of decentralization over decision making regarding data decision. With this in mind, I would know, is there a trend in the near future to adopt blockchain as the main mechanism of business? If so, do you think that the data protection legislation will already be overcome with regard to the figure of data control as who make the decision regarding to processing of personal data?
Amelia, do you want to take a stab at it, or should I try to?
I had a bit of trouble hearing the question. The connection kind of phased out for me, but it seemed like it related to data privacy.
It does. And Antonio, could you just rephrase it in 30 seconds or less, please?
Yes. And I would like to know, is there a trend in the near future to adopt blockchain as the main mechanism of business? If so, do you think the data protection legislation would already be overcome with regard to the figure of the data control as who makes the decision regarding the processing of personal data?
Let me try to answer by saying, I think the future, there are a couple models. You could go with regulation, enlightened there's like draconian regulation on thinking. There's enlightened regulation, which I don't have a lot of hope for because technology moves far faster than our regulators can handle. And then there's the market. that the market will decide. But that requires an education. How long did it take for all of us, and so very few of us still have figured it out, that Facebook is making money, is harvesting our data, and that's their business model. If they're giving it to us for free, the service, then we've got to be paying some other way, and that's through the lack of privacy. But to your question of whether it's going to be adopted wholesale or widely, I think we're still not there yet. It's a shame. I think it'll be adopted widely in China. I think that's going to be the first place. And then through the One Belt, One Road, you're going to see it filter its way in infrastructure projects, in health insurance, in household and other kinds of insurance, in energy going forward, entertainment, I'm missing one, and banking, finance, and decentralized DeFi, decentralized finance. But it's all about use cases. It's about testing now. And because until companies adopt this, a lot of companies are talking about doing blockchain. A lot of people are just bringing on somebody to blockchain and are adding blockchain to their name so they can raise money. But until we can scale up to the transactions per second that will rival some of the payment systems that exist out there now, we're not going to get the wide scale adoption in anytime soon. We will in China. The question will be, the U.S. and other Western powers are going to keep that DCEP out of the West because it's a huge threat to sovereignty and to the incredible value that the U.S. dollar has as the global reserve currency. The moment it's displaced, and we have to price the U.S. with a regular, with a comparative basis of how other countries price their products, their commodities, their services. We're already overpriced in terms of labor in the U.S. It will be a hugely disruptive thing in the West the moment that the U.S. is no longer the reserve currency. That's not going to happen anytime soon. And I think a digital dollar will ensure that that doesn't happen for many more years to come. But in terms of it becoming the true go-to business default way that we do payments, we're still very far away from that. I wish we were closer, but that's because our regulators still need an education on why this is important. I hope that answered your question. Amelia, did you want to add to that?
I think you covered it well, but I'll only add though that in this hopeful future where there is type of like a business standard to be operated on the blockchain, I certainly don't envision it as being like the same standard for everyone. I just foresee interoperability between different types of blockchains to allow the settlement of different asset types through liquidity providers. So is it going to be the standard? Probably a business won't be able to avoid it in one way or another just because of their involvement in financial services. I see that, at least in the United States, as being the first driver towards adoption and standardization. The Federal Reserve, the digital dollar, and the central banks all starting to harmonize their treatment of digital assets and the use of digital assets within a global economy. So that'll probably be like where the standardization happens in the United States first. But we're seeing standardization in all shapes and sizes. For example, in the digital art realm, and a lot of as Professor Cooper had mentioned, the ERC20 token, which was like the de facto capital raising ICO token. The standards behind the token types, I think, as like an interesting trend to watch. You see there's ERC 115, ERC 721, which are both token types for non-fungible tokens that have different types of rule sets so that people can interoperate with them across platforms. So you're already seeing standardization within blockchains, but just not standardization of the blockchain impressed onto society. But yeah, as Professor Cooper had mentioned, the financial services would be an area to watch for early adoption.
If we could get property titles, for example, in the US to be covered by this, even just in a few counties as test cases, but you are seeing some interesting experiments, but again, not scaling up. Ohio, the state of Ohio, you can pay your corporate taxes using, I think, 3 different kinds of cryptocurrency: Bitcoin, Ethereum, and maybe Ripple. There are experiments out there that are going on. And we have to see these test cases get a lot of press, get a lot of credibility, and then we'll move to a more national standard. But while we're doing that, the Chinese can command that. And they're operating in Shenzhen with 20 million people. The SOV out of the Marshall Islands or the Sand Dollar out of the Bahamas, those are rarities and fun to talk about, but it's not going to get the kind of traction globally that, say, the DCEP in China will, if that makes any sense. When you can scale up and then bring on these private service providers like Ant Insurance or China Mobile or Alipay. And to the point, by the way, DCEP works even if you're not connected, that you can just work off your cell phone with no broadband or Wi-Fi. So there are ways, and I think Emilio hit the nail on the head, interoperability. But I also want to say that smaller projects, Brazil is the land of possibility. You see the informal, whether it's the Jogo de Bicho on the streets of Rio or which is not regulated by anybody. It pays 100 cents on the dollar every week, right? You pick monkey, you get monkey, you get your money. There's no liquidity issue. It's just customarily it works, right? If that kind of ingenuity and that kind of soulfulness can be applied to permission blockchains or permissionless blockchains, then there's a future here. When you can start to put land titles in Rocinha and create value for people who have favelas, and they can then borrow money against it, then that's a game changer. Because everyone's got a cell phone, right? A smartphone now. How do you then take that next step to give them the ability to create value? And earlier, I think it was Tiago who asked about proof of stake or proof of work. What I'm thinking about more and more is store of value. How do we get the digital assets the value, so that, because that's how you create wealth. That's what Hernando de Soto from Peru talks about, the mystery of Western capital. That the thing that made the West be able to progress and grow exponentially was mortgages, with the ability for land title to then be converted to mortgages, and then to create wealth exponentially. And I think when we start to do that in the informal economy, there will be, everybody talks about Goldman Sachs has got a project and they're investing in it, and UBS and Banco do Brasil, and Itaú, there are different experiments in blockchain going on. I don't think that's where a lot of the action long term is going to happen. I think it's within the power, and that's the beauty of decentralization. It's going to be Corinthian fans, and it's going to be communities that are already on Facebook or other social media that can transfer over and create assets of trust, because you trust other fans of the Corinthians or other fans of Botafogo or whatever football club, that Manchester United or those other or left-handed people or whatever kinds of self-determinist groups, that there is this. And maybe that's me, just my folly, but I know Emilio long-term believes in the DAO. These decentralized autonomous organizations are our future. And we've privatized everything. I lived part-time off and on for years in Chile. They'll privatize you if you stay there long enough. You've experimented with privatization in Brazil and all through Latin America. It's been a total failure in many cases, and in other places it's worked. How do we leverage those experiences and believe in self-determination? And I think this decentralized ledger is that way to get there, so that you don't have to rely on the standard intermediaries that exist. So I'm hoping the marketplace will make it happen.
Thank you, Professor.
Extraordinary lessons we got here tonight.
Yes, I would like to thank you very much for your experience and curiosity and sharing all your researches and work with us. I was very impressed, and I'm sure everybody here is very impressed with Emilio. His background as an engineer is certainly outstanding to work with blockchain issues and IP. Thank you very much, Emilio, for your time and bringing your experience here to us. And Professor Cooper or Jamie, of course, such a nice, always such an interested mind and always researching for new things and edging technologies and how they relate to law. And I mean, we have known each other for so long and you still have this very creative mind. I admire this a lot. Thank you very much for being here. And thank you for your patience as well. I mean, we have been here since 6:30 and now we have 2 hours and I think it's time for everybody to get a rest. And thank you very much for your time and the students as well. You were all very, very great. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for putting up with my fast English, for thinking maybe in Portuguese and translating on the fly as you asked your very insightful questions. Thank you, Zay and Karen, for your friendship and collaboration. And look, I hope this is the start of many talks and collaborations. For those of you who don't know, Karen and Zay have both spoken in my international business transactions classes in San Diego in the last month. I've worked with Emilio in the Washington State Bar Association and through the San Diego Blockchain Foundation. And I'm just most honored. And this is truly globalized. I want to say hello to my mother in Canada who's watching. So hello. And if you see PC Farias, if he should still be alive, if you know who he is, with Antonio Carlos Magaran, tell them hi for me.
Only the grandson.
Yeah. Probably too young to know who those people are, but maybe you've read about them.
You think he's alive? Okay, okay.
Dr. Pitek, he's done a little work on him, but I think he's going to be all right.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Have a good night. Thank you very much. You were great.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Obrigado. Boa noite.